Hello everybody, my name is Rachel and welcome to this first part of my December reading wrap-up. I'm trying to slow things down in December, though my reading pace has ramped back up to what it usually is. I'm not making as many videos this month, so I thought I would do a two-part December wrap-up rather than doing weekly wrap-ups all of this month. And I think I have 8 things to talk about, so let's get straight into them. I'm hoping to make this a briefer video this week. We'll see if I manage that. The first thing I have to talk about is modern HERstory, stories of women and non-binary people rewriting history. This is written by Blair, Imani, and it is heavily illustrated by Monique Lay. So I think the description of this book says that it's highlighting and profiling people who are champions of progressive social change or something like that. Many of them are activists from like the civil rights movement, Black Lives Matter, and then more recent events like the US 2016 elections and stuff like that. So it's 70 women, most of whom I would say are people of color. There's also a great representation of transgender people, non-binary, queer people, and stuff like that. And that's exactly what I was looking for. I really have enjoyed books on this topic that talk about influential women who shouldn't be forgotten in history. But most of the books that I've read before or been aware of have been about, well, to be perfectly blunt about it, white women who are dead. And this is the opposite of that. It's mainly people of color who are contemporary, many of whom are still just in the early stages of their careers and their activism. So I learned a lot while reading this, though I was surprised at how many people I did recognize, at least their names, probably because they've been in the news for recent events and I've been paying attention to that. The only slight negative I have to say about this is that I felt like it was written in a kind of perfunctory way. It got a bit repetitive in something. Maybe it's that it really felt more like a bulleted list of what some of these people had done, like I was being read their resumes rather than being told stories about them. It just didn't have that storytelling voice that I expected, so that's a minor quibble that's kind of, my taste versus what other people may want. Then I read Sparrow Hill Road by Seanan McGuire. I have this physical copy, but I actually listened to it on audiobook and I really enjoyed it that way. This is less a novel and more like a series of connected stories jumping around in time about the main character, Rose, who is a ghost. She's a road ghost, a hitcher, I think is what they call it, hitchhiker. She is the original girl in the diner, the girl in the green silk dress, the teenage girl on her way to prom who dies in a fiery crash on the road. And the stories are about her existence as a ghost as she finds people who are going to die on the road, and she's there to be with them and to help them move on after they've died so they don't become ghosts. I really enjoyed the format and the stories and jumping between different time periods and getting backstory here and there. It all knit together very well. I also think that this was particularly good to listen to on audiobook because I think that the subject matter, the urban legend feel, the ghost stories feel really melds with oral storytelling, so having these stories read aloud really works. So I enjoyed that. Despite not being super into urban fantasy, this turned out to be kind of a subgenre of urban fantasy that I really enjoyed, though I think a little bit goes a long way for me. I think I'm gonna wait a little bit before I proceed on to the sequel, which I think just recently came out. I'm curious to know if it is the same type of book and story as this first one is. Is it like a collection of stories, or is it more of a straight novel? And is there much forward momentum with the plot, I guess? So I will find out eventually, but I think I need to take a break so that I don't overdose on a good thing. Then there is Fire by Elizabeth Hand. This is a little mini collection. My favorite piece from this is the very first story, which is called The Saffron Gatherers. This was a reread for me. I actually encountered this story not that long ago in an anthology, and I loved it. I almost don't want to describe too much of the story because I feel like I went into it completely blind and I loved it, and the end was so shocking to me because I didn't know anything that was going to come. This time, even though I knew what was going to happen, I could see the foreshadowing more. I could see the way the story was structured and I loved it. It was just so good, and I still cried at the end. Unfortunately, the title story, Fire, is the one piece out of this that I did not like. It is written from a particular perspective, like one half of a dialogue, so it sounds like somebody's talking to you, but you can't actually hear the other side of the conversation. You just get their responses to questions and stuff. I hate this particular style of writing questions. There was no way I was going to like this story because I just dislike that mode so much. And then there is a piece, kind of like an in memoriam obituary piece on Thomas Dish, who I'd never heard of before, but Han just wrote so well about him. Apparently he was very prolific. He wrote genre fiction, but also literary fiction and poetry. And he sounds like he was quite a character to know in real life. I'm not sure that I really would care to read his work, but just hearing about him and the kind of person he was very interesting. So overall, this is a very strong collection. The only thing I didn't like in it was the title story, and that was very brief. Next up, I read Swordheart by T. Kingfisher, which is Ursula Vernon's pen name when she's writing her fantasy for adults. This is kind of a standalone story, but it's set in the same world as the Clock Tower War duology, which is the Clockwork Boys and the Wonder Engine, and I read those earlier in the year and I loved that duology. So when I realized that Swordheart was set in the same world, I jumped straight on it. But this is roughly about a middle-aged widow named Hala who is left her uncle Silas's entire estate. He was pretty wealthy and now she has all of his money, but his family objects to this and they attempt to get control of her inheritance by holding her prisoner in her own home, and they want to force her to marry her cousin with the clammy hands so they can get their hands on her money. So after 3 straight days of being locked in her bedroom, she is desperate, she has no options, and she's contemplating committing suicide with this gigantic sword that's been hanging on her wall for a long time. And when she pulls the sword down and is trying to figure out how you impale yourself on a gigantic sword all by yourself, she unsheathes it and a man appears. Apparently there is an immortal warrior captured in the sword, and whoever owns the sword is his master. So he's like, hey, you're my mistress now, also please put on some clothes. It's hilarious. It's a great scene. And then he helps her escape and get her inheritance, and other things arise, and of course they start having feelings for each other. And it was so funny. It was just hilarious. I laughed so much, and it was also sweet. I did like the way that the relationships developed, and I was really invested in it, and I love this world. It is pretty light, fluffy, funny fantasy, and exactly what I wanted to read. I love Ursula Vernon's work. Then I moved from that book, which I enjoyed so much, to one which was unfortunately quite a disappointment, and that is Red Moon by Kim Stanley Robinson. I can't believe I'm about to say I was bored by a Robinson novel, because this has never happened before, but I was entirely uninterested in the plot, the topic, the themes, and the characters of this book. It's his newest book, it just came out, and it's kind of a political science fiction book. This book focuses on a rising social cultural revolution in China in the 2040s. And the 3 main characters are basically on the run from the Chinese government, or aiding each other on the run, and they kind of bounce back and forth between China and the moon as they're trying to avoid being recaptured. And the fact is, a lot of it is about Chinese politics and Chinese culture, and that kind of translated to the moon as well. And I did not know a lot of the background material that probably would have made this more interesting. I don't know that much about the history of China and its politics and everything, or its previous revolutions. So I was probably missing information there, but it's not something I'm usually interested in outside of fiction, and the story itself failed to interest me in the topic as well. So I don't have much to say about this one. I think it just really missed the mark for me in my personal taste and what I enjoy reading about. But I also can't help but feel like there's something fundamentally weak about this book. It just did not have the spark and the life that other novels by Robinson have had. I think he has written some other books that are much, much better places to begin with. Then I read The Atheist in the Attic by Samuel R. Delany, which is another one of these slim little collections. This one I really only liked one piece from. It's his 1998 essay called Racism and Science Fiction, and it was fantastic. I can't believe I have never heard of this essay before, especially because there have been so many conversations about racism and diversity and representation in SFF, in books and publishing, and in the community itself. And this was such a good essay on the topic, and it's still very relevant. It answered a lot of questions I had about Delany's own experience with racism in the field, given that he is so famous as pretty much the first well-known African-American science fiction writer. So that piece itself is worth buying this little collection for if you can't find it anywhere else. I'm not sure if it's available online anywhere. The other pieces in this were just the title story, The Atheist in the Attic, which is a historical fiction novella about Leibniz meeting Spinoza in Amsterdam in the 1600s. Real people, real event. I did not follow what was happening. I know very little about these men from history, and it was very much about their work in mathematics and philosophy and religion. I just did not know enough to appreciate it, and I didn't really like the way it was written either. It was kind of confusing. Then there is the usual interview with the author, which I thought was just okay. But man, that essay on racism in the field was really, really good. Next, I read Creatures of Will and Temper by Molly Tanzer. This is another one that I own a physical copy of it, but I actually listened to it on audiobook, and I really liked this one on audio as well. I think the narrator's name is Charlotte Gray. Maybe I should check that. I've listened to her before because I recognized her voice, and I really like the way that she narrates. So this is a supernatural take on The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Though I have to admit that I haven't read Dorian Gray in years, so if there are more than superficial similarities, I did not pick up on them. I didn't really read this as a take on Dorian Gray, I really just read it as a mildly supernatural historical novel. So this is about two sisters. The younger one is named Dorina Gray, and then her older sister, Evadne. They go to spend the summer in London with their uncle Basil, and Basil's friend, Lady Henrietta Wotton, called Henry, was the twin sister of his lover who had died prior to the events of the novel. Henry has a demon inside of her, which is important. So Basil makes Henry promise to not interfere with or try to seduce his nieces when they arrive. And you know, to her credit, I don't think she actually does. I think she keeps her promise. But when the women arrive, Dorina falls so hard for Henry and attempts to seduce her, and then ends up joining with Henry's circle of friends who are essentially hedonists who have invited demons into them, which enhances their perception and senses. And then Evadne is an avid fencer, and she begins taking lessons at a fencing academy in London, where she becomes part of a group of young men who say they are demon hunters. And so the story is about this sisterly relationship. These women are very different people, they don't get along, but how much do they care about each other, you know? And that's what I really ended up reading it for. The first half was just enjoyable, but the second half, the characters, their development, and then their relationship managed to avoid the cliche and stereotypical direction I thought they were going into, and it just surprised me so much by the end. So it was a really good story. I think that the influences from Dorian Gray were interesting but didn't overpower the story. I thought this was just going to be kind of an average. I enjoyed it, 3-star book, and the ending of it really took it up a notch for me. I believe there is a sequel, which I will probably seek out as well. You know, this is a Victorian era London, and I think the other book is 1920s New York City, so it could be very different, but I'm willing to give it a shot just because I thought that the characters in this one were done so well. The last thing I have to talk about is this little novella called The Adventure of the Incognita Countess by Cynthia Ward. This is one of the conversation pieces from Aqueduct Press, and that is the reason why I picked it up. I didn't know anything about it. I'm just interested in reading more of the conversation pieces. It turned out to be quite a fun and brisk adventure, and it's a pastiche of a bunch of famous action adventure and supernatural fantasy stories from the early 20th century and prior to that as well. So just to give you an idea, the main character is Lucy Harkness. She is the Dampier daughter of a human woman and Dracula. Her alleged biological father was that dude Harkness who killed vampires. Her stepfather is Moriarty, which means her step-uncle is Sherlock Holmes. She's an agent for the British Empire, and she's sent on the Titanic to keep plans to the Nautilus, Jules Verne reference, I think, from falling into the hands of the Germans. And while on the Titanic, she meets Carmilla and they fall in love. Oh, and there's that guy who's actually Tarzan as well. I liked him. I wish that he'd appeared more in the story. So those are just the things that I noticed, because this is not an era of like action adventure, supernatural fiction that I pay that much attention to. I'm not sure if this ever became more than the sum of its parts, if it ever added something new to build on top of all the references it was making. But it was a lot of fun, and I liked it just because it entertained me. I think there is a sequel that's already out, and I may get it because I am curious about the future relationship potential between Carmilla and Lucy. Just why not? Those are all the things that I read in the first half of December. Do let me know if you have read any of these or want to. Leave me your comments down below. And thank you very much for watching. I'll be back to talk to you again soon, and until then, bye.